now let me get back to why we are here, actually. So, of course, Professor Kokobobo from the Slavic Department is the first speaker of the Brownbag lecture series at CREASE. The title of her talk is A Sexual Theory of the State, Tolstoyan Abstinence in the Era of Me Too. And I will say a couple words about Professor Kokobobo before she starts speaking. Annie Kokobobo received her BA from Dartmouth in 2005 and PhD from Columbia University in 2011. She's currently Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Slavic Department at KU, as well as editor of the Tolstoy Studies Journal. She has published 2 edited volumes, Russian Writers in the Fin de Siecle, The Twilight of Realism, 2015, as well as Russia's Regional Identities, The Power of the Provinces, in 2018. Her monograph, Russian Grotesque Realism, The Great Reforms and Gentry Decline, came out in 2018 with the Ohio State University Press. She has published over 20 academic articles, and her writing for the public has appeared in the Washington Post, Salon.com, the New Republic, Business Insider, and Los Angeles Review of Books. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's going to take me a minute to set this all up. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming here on this Tuesday after Labor Day, no less. So this is part of my second book, so I will welcome comments afterwards, but I'll just get started. And Soviet Jewish writer Isaac Babel once famously asserted that, quote, if the world could write by itself, it would write like Lev Tolstoy. One of the greatest realist writers of all time, Tolstoy captures the pulse of the world in his writings to produce a perspective that's often deeply grounding, particularly as we navigate the exigencies of the present. For instance, when Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election, I personally found myself relying almost exclusively on Tolstoy's War and Peace, which I was teaching at the time, to take the long view at our political world and see the limits of any one person's political power. And if Tolstoy can provide useful perspectives on contemporary political realities, then I've also found, and what I'd like to talk to you about today, is that the reverse is also true. The exigencies of the present have their way of reflecting back on Tolstoy, unsettling the calm and perhaps unveiling a new author, one ripe for the 21st century. And this 21st century Tolstoy, inevitably, is one that comes through the reckoning of the Me Too movement, a movement which has brought down many powerful and seemingly untouchable men, well, and women recently, and which oddly casts a somewhat gentler light on Tolstoy. Not so much Tolstoy the man, because thanks to his obsessive chronicling of his life in his diaries, we're all too aware of all of his personal indiscretions and have been confronting these for years. And let me tell you, it's a rough business being a feminist and a Tolstoy scholar, though not always, and this is what I hope to get at today. The Me Too movement, with its push for a new non-heteropatriarchal world order, casts an interesting new look on Tolstoy, the writer and thinker, and his theory of sexuality. Many have wondered about the ultimate motivations of the Me Too movement, just as others have expressed anxiety about its ever-expanding scope. The Me Too revolution begins with an understanding of what it means to live in a body that can be sexually violated within the bounds of a society in which power is dramatically skewed. In this sense, then, for Me Too, female oppression, despite its socioeconomic and systemic scope, begins within the realm of sexuality and gender archetypes and power dynamics therein. From this perspective, the movement is at least in part also revisiting earlier debates from the 1980s, when feminist thinkers like Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin similarly focused their feminism on the body and the sexual realm, arguing that sexuality and patriarchy has violent overtones, while seeking to remove rape from its separate category of assault and seeing it instead as part and parcel of sexuality at large. In discussions of the violent overtones of sexuality and all the ways in which it can at times dehumanize women, the abstinence preaching age, sex addict Leo Tolstoy seems oddly up to date all of a sudden. After all, he advanced similar arguments long ago, though admittedly from his own profoundly androcentric perspective. By and large, Tolstoyan ideas about sexuality, particularly as expressed in the Kreutzer Sonata, have tended to be seen as either unusually idiosyncratic and motivated by personal complexes, such as the difficult marriage that the Tolstoys had, or as deeply misogynistic. There's a wide-ranging critical tradition revolving around the misogyny theory. And I'm thinking here, the Tolstoyan misogyny theory. And I'm thinking here of scholars like Olga Matic, Rosalind Marsh, and others who've described works like the Kreutzer Sonata as an attack on women and feminism. And then exceptions to this line of thinking, like Barbara Helt and Amy Mandelker, who in turn have argued for a feminist Tolstoy, despite all odds, or at least a non-misogynistic Tolstoy. Whether we view Tolstoy as a misogynist or a feminist, however, may actually be beyond the point. Part of the problem with the misogyny thesis is that it hasn't allowed much room for scholars to conceptualize the complicated and interesting ideas about gender and sexuality that Tolstoy advances, particularly in his later years. So what I want to do in this presentation then, and this is why I bring up Tolstoy alongside feminist thinkers, and will later compare his ideas to some contemporary queer theorists, is to shift the debate somewhat in order to bring out a different Tolstoy, Tolstoy the gender theorist, who advances a complicated theory of the state with sexuality at its center. As some of you may already know, after completing Anna Karenina in 1878, Tolstoy entered a period of depression and subsequent unnecessary reflection, which he himself characterized as a religious conversion. Confronted with existential despair over the inevitability of human mortality, Tolstoy found comfort in the original words of the Gospels, which he reinterpreted to fit his own needs. Out of this process emerged the key gospel idea of not resisting evil with violence, which Tolstoy really took to heart, and which was the core principle of his later philosophy. This principle fueled his pacifism and formed the basis for a new, unapologetically anarchist worldview, defined by many anti-establishment ideas and complete disavowal of governmental and social institutions. Usually, however, when scholars speak of Tolstoy's ideas of nonviolence and sexuality, they tend to view these as disparate from one another. In rethinking Tolstoy's ideas about sexuality, I think it's important to discern the internal ideological relatedness between his abstinence and his pacifism, which together, I would argue, make up a consistent ideological worldview reflecting the author's essential creed of nonviolence. In the sense that, no differently than feminists like Dworkin and McKinnon, Tolstoy came to view heterosexuality and within marriage and the family as no less violent than other institutions, like the military, and I'm not exaggerating. Tolstoy's denunciation of both violence and sexuality as violence were part of a larger attempt at reconceptualizing the whole social order in non-violent terms, beginning with human relationships. This reconceptualization is reflected throughout his late fiction, which will be my focus, with a special emphasis on the Kreutzer Sonata and the late story Master and Man. As I show, Tolstoy increasingly moves away from the heterosexual societal ideal and toward overwhelmingly male texts. In what I would describe as a transition toward queer and generally non-normative relationship patterns, in his late fiction, we see virtually no Tolstoyan happy families. There are fewer women, or female characters are stylized so as not to be eroticized in narrative. And finally, there are several strictly platonic rapports between men. On the one hand, Tolstoyan late texts, like the Kreutzer Sonata and Master and Man, represent a kind of narrative abstinence that echoes the author's broader sexual abstinence. In other words, Tolstoy seems to be saying that in order to not fornicate with women, one had to stop writing about them as sexual objects in literature. But beyond prohibition, there is also Tolstoy's profound ambition and his desire to reconfigure the world according to his own new gospel ideas. From this perspective, then, the Kreutzer Sonata and Master and Man, and other works too, later works, articulate a new world order, which takes form along gender lines and is rooted in the sexual realm. In what I believe, the first of several works that articulate Tolstoy's new post-conversion theory of the state, divorced from violence, he asserts that at its heart, Christianity is about being at peace with all individuals. As he clarifies in the later work, The Kingdom of God is Within You, which was partly inspired by American pacifists like William Lloyd Garrison, there's a commandment at the heart of Christianity that, quote, forbids men to resist evil by violence. On a most basic practical level, this means not participating in institutions directly involved in violence, like the military. But refraining from murder does not exhaust Tolstoy's intellectual messaging. Rather, peaceful living is an entire worldview, characterized by the expectations of gentle, nonviolent affiliation. As Tolstoy writes, the more complex society grew, the more, quote, conquest, rather than moral influence, became what united individuals within social institutions. Building on the idea of selfishness, which is described as an essentially violent force, in what I believe, Tolstoy argues that individuals strive to attain their ends at the expense of others, thus creating a need for, quote, subjugation by power, or in other words, by violence. Any social authority over another is thus founded on coercion. Quote, physical violence is the basis for coercion. If men submit to authority, it is only because they fear that if they resist, they will be subjected to violence, end quote. Looking at society from the perspective of almost a modern-day Foucaultian, Tolstoy argues that the trappings of the state, such as taxes, public duties, fines, and other penalties, are designed to make individuals compliant. Although men seem to yield voluntarily, he writes, their actions are always enforced by the physical threat or the reality of physical punishment. Armies, which theoretically exist for the purposes of external defense, are also there to intimidate subjects. In turn, by yielding to military conscription, individuals become, quote, involuntary participators in the oppressive acts of government toward its subjects. Over time, we see an expansion of this philosophy as violence comes to embody all forms of resistance and practically all social institutions, which greatly limits the possibilities for how individuals can interact with the world, prompting scholars like Michael Denner and others to describe Tolstoy's, quote, late catechism of non-resistance as basically a do-nothing philosophy. Even going further, we might call it a do-nothing-nowhere philosophy because, as other scholars like Ilya Kliger have argued, over time, quote, the morally livable space shrinks further and further, to the point of becoming increasingly marginal. In Tolstoy's later narratives, characters practically fall out of their worlds. Reading the late Tolstoy, then, both his fiction and his nonfiction, it's apparent that the world as it was, with its coercive institutions supported by violence or the threat of it, is fundamentally unsatisfying for the author. What he presents then in, quote, in The Kingdom of God is Within You is a rather ambitious vision, quote, of a new system, not founded upon violence, an essential reorganization of the world, making it a kingdom of God on earth. He's not ambitious at all, obviously. And although Tolstoy presents these issues in a compartmentalized manner in his writings, and the pacifist writing never explicitly addresses questions of sexuality, the systemic violence he notes is not limited to governmental institutions, but extends to, and perhaps even begins, I would argue, with personal and particularly sexual relationships between individuals. So the two can't really be kept apart. As scholars have noted, Tolstoy is hesitant to make concrete the makings of this new world order, in part because he feels that institutions have always been at the root of systemic violence. At the Courteous Sonata, which I will turn to momentarily, he explains that the Christian ideal is not institutionalized or systematized. Quote, Christ did not make any kind of injunctions concerning how life should be lived. He never established any kind of institutions, not even marriage, end quote. Speaking about a potential new world order, in The Kingdom of God is Within You, driven by Christian love, connectivity, and a human family, Tolstoy again refuses to give clear shape to this order and responds to anxiety about giving up the comforts of the present simply by saying, we cannot know the conditions of the new order of things because we have to work them out for ourselves, end quote. And indeed, moving away from institutions, all that Tolstoy has left to work out a new world order are people, which translates to interpersonal relationships, to be legislated according to his new ideas of sexuality, hence the sexual theory of the state, which I stole from Catherine McKinnon. And here's where I now turn to the Grotesque Sonata and its afterword, which I argue constitute the most important theoretical statements, certainly in the late Tolstoy, about sexuality. One of the most noteworthy things in the Grotesque Sonata is Tolstoy's attempt to move away from the violence of heteronormativity through withdrawal from both sexuality and marriage. Quote, in genuine Christian teaching, there is no foundation for the institution of marriage, writes Tolstoy in the afterword to the Grotesque Sonata. There cannot be and there never was Christian marriage. The ideal of the Christian is love toward God and one's neighbor. Whereas by contrast, quote, carnal love and marriage are forms of service to oneself. Throughout the Grotesque Sonata, there's an interweaving of violence with sexuality and marriage, which integrates sexual abstinence into Tolstoy's larger societal philosophy of nonviolence. As Tolstoy writes in Posnichev's voice, which is sort of absurd, among us, people marry regarding marriage as nothing but copulation, and the result is either deception or coercion, but when, as most frequently happens, the husband and wife have undertaken the external duty of living together all their lives, and begin to hate each other after a month, and wish to part but still continue to live together, it leads to that terrible hell which makes people take to drink, shoot themselves, or kill or poison themselves or one another. Posnichev traces back the intense growing hostility in his own marriage to the first instance of sexual consummation, and shows it growing with each new encounter. As feminist thinker Andrea Dworkin writes in her analysis of the novella in the book Intercourse, quote, according to the killer husband, the murder was not one gross act of physical and violent rage. Instead, the killing was slow, over the long years of their marriage, a consequence of the sex he wanted from her. She cites one of Posnichev's lines in the novella where he says, you think I'm straying from my subject? Not at all. I'm telling you how I killed my wife. Quote, as Dworkin says, quote, the sexual use of her was the killing. As Tolstoy advances through Posnichev, gender inequality begins with intercourse. Woman's lack of rights arises not from the fact that she must not vote or be a judge, but from the fact that she's not man's equal in sexual intercourse. As Posnichev further explains, female enslavement stems from the fact that men consider it, quote, good to avail themselves of her as a tool of enjoyment. So while woman is liberated and given all sorts of rights equal to men, the fact that she continues to be regarded as an instrument of enjoyment sexually keeps her in a position, quote, of the same humiliated and depraved slave, and the man in the position of, quote, a depraved slave owner. What we see at work in the Grotesque Sonata, just as in The Kingdom of God is Within You, is an endeavor on Tolstoy's part to come up with a different configuration outside these existing systems of social violence. Dworkin argues that Tolstoy's male-centric perspective aside, in his distaste for intercourse, quote, both the nature of the act and the inequality of the sexes intrinsic to it, Tolstoy demands radical social change. In some of her more charitable, I would argue, readings of Tolstoy, Dworkin suggests that the writer preaches the end of intercourse as a measured repudiation of genocide, because, as she puts it, in her very own Andrea Dworkin idiosyncratic recreation of Tolstoy's voice, in order not to kill women, we must stop fucking them, end quote. And in fact, what we learn from the Grotesque Sonata, and this is one of the more radical elements of the novella, is that Tolstoy is now done with all sex, including reproductive sex, including, therefore, birth. As radical as some of these propositions sound, if we read The Kingdom of God is Within You and the Grotesque Sonata alongside each other, then what we can see is that the violence inherent in sexuality is a violence that begets humanity. And ultimately, if the radical social change the pacifist Tolstoy seeks is going to be accomplished, that change has to begin in the sexual realm, because in his view, so does the violence. It begins with intercourse. It begins with birth, before birth. if, rather than focusing on Tolstoy's own personal failings and his inability to abide by his own abstinence dictates, in fact, when he was writing the Quartet Sonata, he was very concerned his wife would be pregnant with their 14th child. Instead of doing this, instead of judging him, we reconceptualize his ideas about sexuality as geared toward violence, coercion, and larger social change. Then some portion of these ideas, as kooky as we might think they sound, is actually quite compelling. Moreover, many of these ideas are not so different from arguments advanced by feminist thinkers like Dworkin and McKinnon, or even the contemporary Me Too movement. Dworkin aligns Tolstoy with her own thinking and arguments about the violent nature of intercourse in a world defined by male patriarchal domination. As she asserts, in patriarchy, intercourse is a form of, quote, sexual possession, an act of invasion and ownership undertaken in a mode of predation, colonializing, forceful, and nearly violent. Tolstoy's description of sexuality in the Quartet Sonata very closely parallels these ideas. Catherine McKinnon similarly argues about the connection of sexuality and power, using rape and its place in sexuality as an example. In her writing, which has important parallels to the present as well, heterosexuality emerges, quote, as the eroticization of women's subordination. Pardon me. Taking rape from the realm of the sexual, argues McKinnon, placing it in the realm of the violent allows one to be against it without raising any questions about the extent to which institutions of heterosexuality have defined force as a normal part of human relationships. I forged some of these connections, to be clear, between Tolstoy and feminist thinkers, not in order to make the case for the feminist Tolstoy, because that's not really the case, but because they give us a chance to see him as more than a crude misogynist or even an aspiring feminist. These intellectual ties afford the opportunity to engage with Tolstoy as a gender theorist who advocates a new world order. And in fact, given the collective discussions we've been having as a country about power hierarchies and the frequently toxic exchanges between power and sex, I think Tolstoy's ideas are certainly worth thinking about. But what does Tolstoy mean by this new world order, or these new relationships? And how are these reflected in his later writings? I've been transitioning so far between Tolstoy's theoretical writings and his fiction, and I can talk about the relationship between the two later if you're interested. In the time I have left, I will focus almost exclusively on the fiction, which I think in some ways the fiction is more revealing than Tolstoy's theoretical tracts. If there's a discomfort on the author's part in defining concrete practices because institutions and perhaps relationship paradigms of all kind are in some ways coercive, then it's in his fiction that we see these ideas materialize, because in that context, he feels that he can offer concrete examples and experiment with different scenarios in far more open-ended ways. So the first thing we will notice in Tolstoy's New World Order is that women either don't figure in it very much at all, or they appear in a highly stylized manner. Because, as Tolstoy tells us through Poznishev again in the Quartet Sonata, literature has been instrumental in replicating and perpetuating problematic sexual relationships and the objectification of women. In Poznishev's words, quote, "The type of education women received will always correspond to the way men see them. After all, we know that what men think of women, don't we? Even the poets write things like that in their verses. Examine the whole of poetry, painting and sculpture, starting with love poetry and all those naked Venuses and Phrynes, and you'll see that in them woman is an instrument of pleasure, just as she is in Trubnaya Street and the Graviechka or court balls. This discussion of the role," end quote, "this discussion of the role of literature and other arts in the objectification of women seems to evoke a concept that contemporary film critic Laura Mulvey calls the male gaze. Mulvey understands the male gaze as a visual masculine perspective that reflects female bodies as passive visual objects for male viewing pleasure, or scopophilia. Peter Brooks, who picks up on similar ideas in his study of 19th century realism, similarly places the female body at the center of the textual energetics of most realist narratives, as an object of desire that, quote, impels the narrative forward, something to be attained, unveiled, fetishized. Over the years, Tolstoy, great realist writer of women, had certainly been part of the problem that Poznishev diagnoses in contemporary art. As far back as his debut novella, the early trilogy Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, Tolstoy's narrator explicitly denotes the moment when the female body grows sexualized in narrative, through the desire he's able to detect in his own gaze. Seeing the young maid, Masha, in childhood, the narrator remembers the exact moment when he, quote, ceased to regard her as a female servant and began to see in her a woman on whom a certain extent of my peace and happiness might depend, end quote. He then insists that he must be sparse in his description of Masha, pointing out in a seemingly rushed manner that she was very pretty, with uncommonly fair skin and a voluptuous figure, but refuses to engage in the usual tapestry of realist detail for fear that he may become tempted by his own creation. "I'm afraid to describe her," writes the narrator, "lest my imagination should again present to me the bewitching and delusive image which filled my mind at the time of my infatuation," end quote. So in order to not objectify women, one had to avoid literary renditions of the female form altogether. And by and large, the late Tolstoy is true to this. He abstains from most depictions of women, focusing his attention instead on stories of men and their spiritual evolution. Just think of the titles: Haji Murat, the devil's a woman, but the point. Father Sergius, Alyosha the Pot, Master and Man, and even the Courteous Sonata, perhaps even Resurrection. The titles themselves will tell us that these are overwhelmingly male texts, anchored around male subjects, if nothing else, in which women, with few exceptions, recede in the background. In the Courteous Sonata, we don't even know the name of Posnishev's wife. And when Tolstoy does depict women in later narratives, he stylizes these depictions, using often death's body as a way to displace desire's body. Going as far back as childhood, instead of Masha's body, we see the corpse of the narrator's mother. In Resurrection, the last realist novel of the 19th century, Tolstoy at times captures the heroine as outright, this is Maslova, as outright ugly, once comparing her to a spoiling potato. And when he allows himself any aestheticization, he surrounds moments of female beauty or romantic descriptions of love with overwhelming, nauseating images of death. In fact, the romantic backstory in the novel is bordered by an autopsy report, literally, and the discussions of a murdered merchant's deformed bodily organs. The substitution of desire with death hints at Tolstoy's broader attempts at reconfiguring human relationships in their entirety, with death and mortality emerging as a new point of orientation in his narratives. As the author writes in the afterword to the Courteous Sonata, quote, "Getting married cannot promote the service of God, even in the case of marriage for the purpose of continuing the human race. It could be infinitely simpler if these people, rather than getting married to produce children's lives, would support and save those millions of children who are perishing around us from a lack of material, to say nothing of spiritual sustenance," end quote. This statement suggests that instead of focusing on birth and reproduction, the new aim of civilization should be preservational in nature, or informed by an understanding of human vulnerability and mortality. This principle relates to the peculiar theology Tolstoy devised in his reinterpretation of the New Testament Gospels, namely an understanding of human existence as deriving from two different sources: God, or the spiritual foundation of human life, and the human individual, and the physical side of life emerging from the mother's womb. According to this model, if birth is tied to the physical beginnings of life, then death marks another beginning, a rebirth, a spiritual return to the source. In a diary entry dating to March 12 of 1895, about 2 weeks after his youngest son, Ivan, died of scarlet fever at the age of 7, Tolstoy writes, "One must always live as though a favorite child is dying in a room nearby. He is always dying, and I am always dying." Although Tolstoy does not explain this statement any further, he acknowledges that the loss of little Vanyushka was even more profound for him than the loss of his brother Nikolai, whose death had been one of the contributing factors to his crisis in the 1870s. But not exactly from a perspective of mourning and grief, because mourning, and this is a whole other topic, is an extraordinarily complicated, particularly impossible thing for the late Tolstoy. Rather, he explains that he considers the death of Ivan to be, quote, "a merciful event, a manifestation of God, disentangling the lies of life and bringing me closer to him," End quote. These statements from the diary hint at the importance Tolstoy ascribes to death as a rebirth in his later years. Not only does death supplant birth, but death also stops desire on its tracks. From this perspective, then, rather than creating new people, Tolstoy thinks we should concentrate on caring for and loving the already living children whose lives may be less than ideal. They may be dying in a room nearby, and how trivial it might seem to focus on sexual desire when death is approaching. In the late Tolstoy's mind, awareness of our vulnerability to mortality, this always dying state, extends the possibility for connections far deeper than those forged by intercourse. Instead of focusing on the future, children, the reproductive ideal, Tolstoy orients himself toward death, its spiritual potential, and how to prepare for it. And if the birthing model would naturally lead in marriage, the late Tolstoy in death-oriented text leads to something quite different, a world order driven by non-normative, often same-sex spiritual kinships and configurations. In fact, we might see Tolstoy as a queer theorist of sorts at this point, who doesn't merely preach abstinence, but seeks to completely reorient or queer human relationships. Lee Edelman and Jack Halberstam have argued that the heterosexual marriage is characterized by an orientation toward futurity, future happiness, material production, success. By contrast to this heteronormative optimism, the promise of a future driven by one's children, Edelman, Halberstam, Leo Bersani, Jose Munoz, and others have defined a queer mode of being as an escape from marriage and other social institutions, precisely the kinds of withdrawals that Tolstoy also sought. As Edelman writes, quote, "The child marks a fetishistic fixation of heteronormativity, an erotically charged investment in the rigid sameness of identity that is central to the compulsory narrative of reproductive futurism." End quote. He proposes the psychoanalytic concept of the death drive as an alternative, as a space of refusal, negativity, destructiveness, and the antithesis of reproductive futurism. Advancing a similar argument, Halberstam, perhaps no differently than Tolstoy, at one point or another, moves beyond the child to argue that the concept of the heterosexual family is, quote, a deeply reactionary understanding of human interaction which erases other modes of kinship. Quote, as a kind of false narrative of continuity, as a construction that makes connection and succession seem organic and natural, family also gets in the way of all other sorts of alliances and coalitions, end quote. Zeroing in on Dory, the forgetful and confused character from the Pixar film Finding Nemo, Halberstam presents alternative ways of being and of relating to others. Dory is the quintessential queer subject, marked by anti-generationality and anti-familial kinship. She's not bound or beholden to anyone because she can never remember anyone for very long. Plagued by the failure of short-term memory, she's always losing her way and therefore forgetting hegemonic patterns, thus embodying queer temporality, a break with linear and teleological history and success. As Halberstam argues, Dory is a failure by conventional standards, but she has access to different ways of knowing and being that prove beneficial and at times even superior. Now, this book is a little bit dated because I'm sure you've all seen when Dory then goes to find her parents in the sequel, but we'll leave that aside. If ensemble level queering means divesting from heteronormativity with its potentially violent overtones, then this kind of divestiture is precisely what we see in the late Tolstoy, as the author launches us into different kinds of kinship. One late story, Master and Man, presents a particularly interesting case study for how Tolstoy re-envisions relationships outside of marriage. Master and Man begins as a conventional story of social exploitation and dominance, with one man, the master, holding all the power and seeking to extract more financial profit for his growing nuclear family. The master has very clear purpose. He's always calculating sales, eagerly moving toward more financial rewards, as during the trip that he and Nikita take together. This is the man. A baby and a pregnant wife round out this proper heteronormative forward momentum. Quote, the sight of his son, whom he always thought of as his heir, now gave him great satisfaction, says Tolstoy about Vasily Andreevich, the master. There's something fundamentally selfish about family as it appears in this narrative, and Tolstoy undercuts the appearance of happiness through a vision of husband and wife that actually deeply dislike each other. On the other hand, the peasant, Nikita, although also married, spends most of his time away from home. He wanders around, and he never settles down in any one particular place. Although Nikita has not forgotten his family and those kinships, in fact, he always sends them money, the bond of marriage has become loosened, and he's so detached that he's virtually unbothered by his wife's adultery. In this sense, the snowstorm that derails the journey and forces the two men into a circuitous or backward route interrupts the master's forward trajectory, circumstantially situating both men outside the bounds of society. And therefore, also outside the bounds of marriage, as the master is forced to assume Nikita's itinerant lifestyle. It is within this organic and natural setting where they confront the finality of life, rather than the potentials of reproduction and accumulation, that the master has his moral epiphany. Although Tolstoy the realist does not undo social structures in this narrative, in many of his later works, he plays around with setting so as to place characters outside of society or marriage, or preferably both. At first, when trapped overnight with Nikita, the master's selfishness breaks through. Attached to the self-centered model, where he's supposed to be striving only for the betterment of his immediate family and future generations, he decides that he can't possibly sit there, quote, waiting for death. He walks away with a dying horse, the only horse they have, leaving Nikita behind. It's all the same to him, whether he lives or dies. He says about Nikita, what is his life worth? Yet it is precisely during this moment of ultimate selfishness that the circumstances of the blizzard intervene. Instead of charging forwards to go back to his path of reproduction and accumulation, Vasily, the master, ends up driving backwards, and intentionally or unintentionally returning to where Nikita is lying and dying. In the process of traveling backwards, the master confronts his own death, which precipitates a moral transformation. Instead of walking away and letting Nikita die, he lies on top of him and warms him all night in order to, save his life, while he himself freezes to death. He wants to preserve Nikita's life because, at least within the bounds of Tolstoy's later religious philosophy, these two individuals are fundamentally connected as a result of having come from the same spiritual beginning, or God. Quote, he, the master, remembered that Nikita was lying under him and that he had gotten warm and was alive. And it seemed to him that he was Nikita, and Nikita was he, and that his life was not in himself, but in Nikita. Now, if I were going to read the scene in a tongue-in-cheek, obnoxious way, which Tolstoy would be very angry at me for, I'd say that there's a lot of homoeroticism going on with these people being inside each other and lying on top of each other. But I'm not going to read the scene in that way. Not entirely, anyway. What Tolstoy means to show in these moments is that despite inhabiting different bodies, we're all connected. So not only is selfishness outright irrational within the context of this collective and larger spiritual life, but death becomes essentially a non-event, since real life does not reside within the individual and mortal body. The master lives through Nikita, we live through everyone else. To go back to my beginning then, we can see a new world order grow prominent in these narratives as deep spiritual ties take the place of biology, and gender markers, as well as the power dynamics therein, are erased when we all become part of God, which for Tolstoy figures as appropriately neuter in the original Russian. In his translation of the Gospels, he calls God Nachalo Всего, the beginning of everything. The status quo of gender relations is unacceptable to him because he feels it degrades both men and women. Obviously, his solution, chastity and abstinence, is not terribly practical as such, and it certainly would mean the extension of the human race, and it erases male and female desire. But Tolstoy's understanding and attempts at reconceptualizing sexuality are anything but crude. To note how Tolstoy erases women's agency and simply call him a misogynist produces, I think, a simplistic picture of what is a complicated and ambitious endeavor to forge a new reality. As I've been trying to illustrate, Tolstoyan chastity is multidimensional. It is launched by a virtually feminist concern about sexuality and power hierarchies, and it concludes with some version, however platonic, of queer non-normativity. The exchanges between life and death, or sex and death, fluctuate in the course of Tolstoy's long creative career, but in the end, even though he seeks to move beyond the physical entirely, I wonder if Tolstoy isn't simply writing new and different love stories in his later works. In the final analysis, Tolstoy in Chastity always retains a touch of ambiguity. The spiritual presence of God within us, how our spiritual presence figures inside each other, suggest eternal connection, a way to be present for one another that is perhaps deeper and more enduring than the connection provided by intercourse. Strictly removed from all social hierarchies and sexuality, the moments of human connection in master and man are nonetheless profound. So is the connection between the narrator and the confessing murderer, Poznishev, in the later Sonata, or between Ivan Ilyich, from the death of Ivan Ilyich, and his manservant, who provides asexual but comforting physical touch to Ivan's battered and dying body, or finally, between the violated prostitute Maslova in Resurrection and Simonson, the only man who doesn't seek sex from her. Even for all of his emphasis on abstinence and the move away from the body, Tolstoy's theology is in some respects profoundly aimed at connection. In some ways, Tolstoy's model of abstinent human connection, as we see it in Master and Man and other works, uncannily recalls Andrea Dworkin's own decidedly non-normative and purportedly deeply physical, but ultimately far too abstract understanding of intercourse. And this is how she describes intercourse. There is no physical distance, no self-consciousness, nothing withdrawn or private or alienated, no existence outside physical touch. The skin collapses as a boundary. It has no meaning. Time is gone. It too has no meaning. There is no outside. End quote. In these passages, the epitome of anti-sex, Dworkin, emerges as a poet of erotic love, though her descriptions of physical acts are thoroughly disembodied. So the Tolstoyan world order boils down to connectivity without bodies and the vulnerability they introduce. But these connections are not the prudish concoction of a cantankerous old man. They come from a place of longing and of feeling that what is socially sanctioned is perhaps simply not enough. And in his immortal, neuter God, Tolstoy the orphan, who was terrified of death and loss his whole life, finds an eternal parent, a steady lover, and a constant companion. What's the time? Sorry, I'm done.
We have 9 minutes for questions.
I started late.
Are there any?
Well, I have a comment.
Yes, ma'am.
As I say, it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
As you were speaking, I kept thinking that for all of his desire for human connectivity, the female force is completely excluded from that connectivity.
Well, in his
And-
way.
Yeah, well, but any female force, because the one thing he seems unable to create a paradigm for, he's got paradigms for all these other things, all these other models, but he is unable to create a paradigm in which there is male-female friendship or male-female equality.
Right, so are you still, so I think like in Resurrection,
So I'm just asking, do you?
yeah, no, I mean, I think in Resurrection we have Maslova and Simonson who are in this sexless partnership. I mean, I think, I don't know, like, so in my, I can't necessarily prove it. My book is really about this, right? I'm still trying to explore this question, but I think so much of it is about that first female loss, right? It's the mother's body, it's that corpse that takes the place of the desire. And it's like, how do I replace this? And you see many female bodies replacing that first initial deeply profound loss. I think God, in the end, becomes like the replacement because he's this eternal parent. He calls God Father. But you see in his later years, he'll write in his diary and say, mommy, I want mommy. Like, I want you to come and hold me. He's like remembering his mother. He wants this very physical, tactile thing. And God, this like abstract God, doesn't give him that. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, he's going to be a lot more comfortable with his secretary than his wife, right? I mean, you see, like, she wants him to be her husband, and he keeps writing, well, I'm reinventing the world. I don't believe in family anymore, so what do you want from me? You're just preventing me from working, right? So it's very tense, and it's like that resident stranger paradigm that Gustafson talks about until the very end, where he is writing all these things, all these beautiful things, but may or may not be able to ultimately live up to it himself. And he is deeply uncomfortable with the female form, because that's how you... Right?
Not just the female form, but the idea of female being.
Well, I don't know if he's uncomfortable with the idea of female being. What do you mean? Like women as a kind of...
Complete person?
As a complete person? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you read his diaries, right? Yeah, I know. I have friends who talk about this. I know. It, again, I mean, I guess what I'm trying, like, and we know that, right? We've talked about this for a long time, like some of the things that he writes in his diaries and all these misogynistic, objectifying, blah, 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 like women are basically goats, you know, but I'm just kidding. But, you know, I think there is still something there that is interesting outside of all that, you know, and that's really what I'm trying to say, is that we've talked about what a horrible misogynist Tolstoy is for so many years, but is there anything there that's interesting and worth talking about? And I think there is something there that's still deeply interesting. It's just he is a flawed human being, and expecting consistency from this man would be very, very hard. But I take your point, certainly. Is it like 5 minutes or something? Go ahead.
5.
Mine's a bit more of a historical question. Obviously, Tolstoy becomes very interested in his reading of Christianity, his understanding of the Gospels, and very uninterested in the institutional structure of the Russian Orthodox Church. But there's certainly a strain of Christian intellectual culture that, from my point of view, not really knowing what Tolstoy knew and read, has a strong impressionistic resonance with how you described Tolstoy's understanding of gender. So issues of kind of seeing humanity as being basically androgynous. There are strains in the Greek patristic tradition that speak of this way. Obviously, monasticism is a place where male-male relationships become crucially important, and even, you know, erotic in a non-physical sense. The making of brothers in the tradition and so on. So my historical question, because I have no idea, is what does Tolstoy know of the sort of Christian intellectual ascetical tradition which is available in Russia by his time, aside from just the Gospels itself and what he's going to observe kind of institutionally, which is going to obscure that strain pretty strongly?
I mean, I would say quite a bit, but he is not very fond of any kind of like systematized Christian institution, right? And part of his whole process is, even before he goes to the Gospels, is I'm going to like erase the church tradition and all the patristics, because I mean, and then scholars like Richard Gustafson have talked about how actually ultimately this Tolstoyan idea of connectivity is like very tied to orthodoxy. So I think for him, there's a deep discomfort there with organized worship and church thinkers and really anything like that, right? That's why he goes back to the Gospels and it's like, I'm just going to read this and interpret it the way it's meant to from Jesus without the church having distorted it over the, I mean, you know, so, and I mean, he was excommunicated for a reason eventually.
So I guess the question is sort of how, as I hear it, it sounds like a recapitulation of a certain strain of the ascetical tradition.
I mean, absolutely. And I think like in the person of Jesus is so interesting to him, but not because he thinks of him as special, but because he would like to think of all of us that could potentially be like him, which is why he's uncomfortable with the whole kind of idea that he's physically like, you know, part of God, and then the whole virgin birth, all of that, the miracles, like, no. He's really uncomfortable with that, because then they can't be an ordinary story. Like, you can't do it, Tolstoy can't do it. So, but anyway, it's an interesting question. I think they're, you know, he's very secretive. Like, Dostoevsky's very open with his sources. Tolstoy's like very, you know, but he read very broadly in his later writings. You know, he includes quotations from all over, actually, from Islam, Buddhism. So, you know, he then starts interesting, like, one religion that somehow reunites all the different religions and reconciles them and he sees all religions as a solution to the problem of mortality, making it okay, the fact that we're dying. I mean, that's all what religion is about in his mind, that somehow make that tolerable, which, you know, there's a point to it.
He published the book, the Kreutzer Sonata, I think it was 61. So, it, you know,
weird, when you're 50, you definitely have more behind you than ahead of you.
Yeah.
For most people, but you don't really think in those terms. But when you get into your 60s, it's really, you really know that that's
Yeah.
and so you feel your mortality. I'm feeling my mortality more. And it's this thing with religion, it's you know, that he didn't want the trappings of the church because, you know, it's very limiting. And from a feminist point of view, all these religions, their leaders, their heads are male.
Yes.
This creation entity is male, which, you know.
Although I do think it is male for him, but I think also, like, at least linguistically, it is neuter. But you know, it's like I have this eternal male parent, and you know, it's this masculine journey, and the mother that died, I'm done with her. You know, I have to. Yeah, the one he really wants. I mean, he's still like an 80-year-old writing in his diary about I just wanted my mommy to hold me. Like, it's literally in those terms. It's very kind of like childlike terms. Like, he wants, you know, and the only.
It's like some kind of odd residue from Oedipal complex, right? He didn't have to worry about dad. He wasn't competing with dad.
Yeah, it's weird. He's not, yeah.
But, you know.
But he doesn't remember her, right? He never saw her. All he had was this little, like, figurine of her. It was black and white. It was just a black figurine that you could barely see her features. He never saw her. So in a way, you read childhood, and it's like his attempt to recreate that. His whole creativity, I mean, his whole creative output is an attempt to put life into this, you know, blank figurine that he never knew, you know, and then not later, and then he's done with her. I mean, it's all very tense, and, you know.
But he could have filled that figurine with so many things, and this is what he chose.
And this is what he chose to. I know. And we're not even talking about Anna Karenina now. So that's my project this fall. It's like, okay, put it all aside and deal with those demons.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for indulging me.